Welcome, dear listener. Find a comfortable place to rest and let your body begin to soften into the warmth around you. Feel the quiet weight of the moment settling gently over your shoulders, like a soft evening breeze that asks nothing of you, demands nothing, expects nothing at all. Tonight, we are going to travel slowly together, far back through the corridors of time, to the earliest chapters of human civilization, where gods walked among rivers and stars, and where wisdom was considered the most sacred gift of all. There is nothing you need to do right now, nowhere you need to be. Simply breathe, slowly and naturally, and let the story carry you gently forward. Allow each word to arrive softly, like ripples on still water, spreading outward and fading without effort. If thoughts come, let them pass. If images rise, let them drift. You are safe here, suspended between waking and dreaming, listening as the past unfolds in a slow and steady rhythm. Long before the world had words for what it knew, before language learned how to name the sky or measure the earth, the earliest civilizations growing along the banks of ancient rivers began to reach toward something greater than survival. There was a quiet awareness, difficult to describe but deeply felt, that life was not only about endurance, but about understanding. That beneath the cycles of day and night, beneath the flood and drought, beneath the fragile balance of existence, there was a deeper pattern waiting to be seen. In those early settlements, where mud brick homes stood close together and the scent of wet clay lingered in the air, people watched the world carefully. They observed the rising of the rivers, the slow return of the stars, the way shadows moved across the ground at different times of the year. And somewhere within that patient observation, something began to form. Not just knowledge, but a sense that knowledge itself was sacred. The people of Mesopotamia and Egypt gave shape to divine figures whose purpose ran far deeper than ritual or reverence. These beings did not simply receive offerings or demand obedience. They stood as bridges between what was known and what was hidden, between the visible world and the invisible order that seemed to guide it. They rose from the very roots of human consciousness, not merely as objects of worship, but as teachers, as architects of order, as guardians of the knowledge that held the cosmos together. Their stories, pressed into clay and carved into stone, preserve a vision of wisdom so vast and so deliberate that it continues to unsettle everything we thought we understood about the ancient world. And as we move slowly through those stories, we begin to sense something quiet and persistent beneath them. A suggestion that knowledge did not simply appear, but was given, shaped, and carefully placed into human hands. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in the fertile arc of land that would cradle the world's first cities, the Sumerians were quietly shaping something remarkable. The land itself was both generous and unpredictable. Rivers could nourish the soil or sweep it away. The sun could sustain life or withhold it. To live there required not only effort, but understanding, a careful relationship with forces that could not be controlled, only studied and respected. Around 3,200 years before the Common Era, they developed the earliest known writing system, a language of wedge-pressed marks that could capture thought and hold it still across centuries. Imagine for a moment the quiet gravity of that transformation. A thought, once spoken and gone, could now remain. A story could outlive the voice that told it. Knowledge could be preserved, refined, and passed forward with a precision that memory alone could never achieve. Within the grand collection of gods that populated their spiritual world, one figure stood at a particular distance from the rest. Not distant in the sense of absence, but in the sense of quiet depth, like still water that reflects more than it reveals. Not a god of conquest, not a deity of storms or grain, but something altogether more unusual. Enki, known later to the Akkadians as Ea, embodied wisdom as a living principle. He was not simply associated with knowledge. He was its movement, its flow, its quiet emergence into form. He was the patron of fresh water, of skilled crafts, and above all else, of the transmission of knowledge from the divine into human hands. And here, as we linger for a moment, it is worth imagining the feeling of that idea, that knowledge itself flows like water, that it moves from unseen depths upward, emerging where it is needed, shaping what it touches, giving life to what would otherwise remain still. The cuneiform tablets unearthed from ancient Eridu, which was Enki's most sacred city, describe him making his home within the Abzu, a vast underground ocean of fresh water lying beneath the surface of the earth. But this was not simply a geographic detail, not merely a mythic landscape placed somewhere below the soil. The Abzu represented something far more profound: the hidden source, the unseen reservoir from which all life and all understanding emerged. Just as roots draw water from beneath the ground, so too did human awareness draw from deeper currents, currents that were not always visible, but always present. Among the oldest creation stories known to humanity, the Eridu Genesis places Enki at the very center, not merely as a creator of life, but as the architect of civilization itself. And what distinguished him from other divine creators was the quality of the beings he brought into existence. Enki's humans were not fashioned as laborers, nor shaped as servants under the dominion of uncaring gods. They were, from the very beginning, recipients of divine knowledge. Creatures endowed with the capacity for learning, for reasoning, for building things that would last. This idea carries a quiet weight. It suggests that human beings were not created merely to exist, but to understand. Not simply to live, but to learn. And as the story continues, this pattern deepens. The Atrahasis epic, written down around 1700 years before the Common Era, but drawing upon oral traditions, reaching far deeper into antiquity, reveals another layer of Enki's nature. When the god Enlil resolved to end humanity through a great flood, wearied by the noise and restlessness of the mortal world, Enki could not simply stand by. There is something gentle in that resistance. Not loud, not confrontational, but quietly decisive. Moving through the boundary between divine law and human need, he reached out to the mortal hero Atrahasis through the language of dreams and carefully coded messages. And here, the story slows again, because dreams, in ancient understanding, were not illusions, but pathways. In the stillness of sleep, when the mind loosens its grip on the visible world, something deeper becomes accessible. Messages can move where speech cannot. Knowledge can arrive in forms that bypass resistance, entering gently, settling quietly. Enki gave this man precise instructions for constructing a vessel capable of surviving the deluge. Instructions that included specific measurements, construction methods, and engineering principles of the kind that no ordinary dreamer could have invented. And if we pause here, we can almost see it. The careful shaping of wood, the measuring of angles, the quiet concentration of a human mind holding something far larger than itself. Through this act, Enki established a pattern that would echo again and again across human history. Knowledge given not loudly, but quietly. Not to all at once, but to those prepared to receive it. Not as force, but as guidance. The wise figure who chooses human flourishing over rigid order. The teacher who hides truth within symbols, within dreams, within structures that must be discovered rather than imposed. The temples dedicated to Enki were not merely places of prayer. They were places of learning, of observation, of careful and patient accumulation of understanding. Archaeological investigations of Sumerian sacred sites reveal that these complexes function simultaneously as workshops of the mind, repositories for mathematical formulas, astronomical records, and metallurgical techniques. And if you imagine those spaces now, not as ruins but as living places, you can almost hear the quiet activity within them. The scratching of stylus against clay, the soft murmur of instruction, the steady rhythm of thought being shaped into form. The priests who served him were not simply religious practitioners. They were scribes and surveyors, healers and engineers, individuals whose role was to observe, to record, and to preserve. Generation after generation, they gathered and protected what they knew, passing it forward through careful instruction across the long centuries. And in doing so, they became part of the same flow that Enki represented, the slow and continuous movement of knowledge through time. While this was unfolding between the two great rivers, something equally extraordinary was taking shape along the quiet green margins of the Nile. The river moved differently there, slower, more predictable, rising and falling with a rhythm that could be learned, anticipated, trusted. And along its banks, another vision of knowledge began to form, one that emphasized not only understanding, but balance. Before Egypt was unified under its first pharaoh, around 3,100 years before the Common Era, the figure of Thoth was already emerging from the complex spiritual landscape of pre-dynastic Egyptian religion. He began as a deity of the moon and its measured cycles, but over time he became something far more precise, far more defined. Not simply a watcher of time, but its recorder. Not merely an observer of patterns, but their keeper, the divine scribe, the inventor of writing, the guardian of cosmic order through the faithful keeping of records. And here again, we sense that same quiet idea, that knowledge is not only discovered, but maintained, that it requires care, attention, and a kind of stillness that allows truth to be seen clearly. The oldest depictions of Thoth, preserved in tomb paintings from the Old Kingdom, show him as a figure with the head of an ibis, a curved reed pen held with quiet precision, an ink palette resting in his hands. There is something deeply calming in that image. The stillness of the figure, the careful placement of each line, the sense that nothing is rushed, nothing is forced. The ibis itself was a carefully observed creature. Ancient Egyptians noted the graceful arc of its beak, which mirrored the slender crescent of the new moon. And in that simple observation, a connection was made between bird and sky, between form and meaning, between the visible and the symbolic. Thoth's role as timekeeper made him the natural architect of calendars, the divine mathematician who gave structure to the year, and the astronomer whose gaze ordered the night sky into comprehensible patterns. And if you imagine the night sky now, vast, silent, filled with slow-moving light, you can begin to feel the patience required to understand it. The steady watching, the quiet recording, the willingness to wait, to notice, to remember. Among the oldest religious writings on Earth, the pyramid texts speak of Thoth's place in the afterlife, and here the story becomes even more still. In the ceremony depicted so extensively in the Book of the Dead, the weighing of the heart, Thoth stands beside the great scales as a deceased soul's heart is measured against the feather of Mat, the principle of divine truth and balance. He does not judge, he records. And there is something profoundly peaceful in that role. No haste, no emotion, only precision. Only truth, carefully observed and faithfully preserved. His function is that of an impartial witness, ensuring that the cosmic process of justice unfolds according to principle rather than preference, that the measure of a life is taken with care and precision rather than whim. At Hermopolis, the city that ancient Egyptians knew as Khemenu, Thoth's deepest theological significance was inscribed into the walls of his temples. He was named the Tongue of Ra, the sacred creative word through which order emerged from chaos at the beginning of time. And if we allow that idea to settle for a moment, we begin to feel something quiet and vast, that the universe itself may have begun not with force but with expression, not with violence but with articulation. The hieroglyphic texts identify him as the one who reckons in heaven, who counts the stars, who measures and enumerates the earth and all that it contains. These are not merely poetic descriptions. They reflect an ancient conviction that the universe itself is structured, ordered, and intelligible, and that this structure can be known. And so, as we continue to move gently forward, we begin to see the pattern forming more clearly. Across different lands, along different rivers, within different languages, the same quiet idea appears again and again. That knowledge is not accidental, that it is not chaotic, that it flows, is measured, is preserved, and perhaps in some way is given. We move now from those two shining rivers of antiquity to a later body of text, one that draws upon their traditions while casting knowledge in a very different light. The world changes as we move. The stone becomes harsher, the atmosphere more austere, the sense of nearness between heaven and earth a little more tense. If Enki's waters and Thoth's measured pen belong to a vision of wisdom that nourishes and orders, the next tradition carries within it a tremor. A feeling that knowledge, when given at the wrong time or in the wrong way, may wound as easily as it heals. The Book of Enoch, compiled during the Second Temple period, though clearly rooted in much older traditions, introduces us to the Watchers, known in Greek as the Grigori, a class of angelic beings said to have descended from the heavens during the time of Jared, who was the father of the man named Enoch. Their story arrives with an entirely different atmosphere. It is still concerned with the transmission of wisdom, still preoccupied with the crossing of boundaries between the divine and the human, but it is shadowed by a different moral tone. Unlike Enki and Thoth, whose gift of wisdom to humanity is presented as ultimately benevolent, the Watchers represent the darker face of divine knowledge. What happens when the boundaries separating mortal from immortal understanding are crossed without authorization, without preparation, without wisdom? And perhaps that is why this story lingers so powerfully in the imagination. Because it does not deny that the knowledge is real. It does not say the teachings are false. Instead, it asks a more unsettling question. What if something can be true, powerful, and still dangerous? The text tells us that 200 of these beings, led by figures named Semyaza and Azazel, swore a mutual oath upon the summit of Mount Hermon and descended to earth. There is something solemn and heavy in that scene. The high mountain, the vow, the movement downward from the heights into the world of dust and flesh. Ancient stories often mark mountains as places where the boundary between worlds grows thin, where speech rises upward and revelation descends. But here, the descent does not carry only blessing. It carries disruption. They took human partners, and from these unions came the Nephilim, enormous, powerful beings whose presence brought turmoil to the world below. But more significant than their offspring was what the Watchers taught. The knowledge itself becomes the true turning point in the story, the more consequential inheritance. Azazel, chief among the instructors, transmitted the arts of metalworking, the forging of blades, shields, and instruments of war, alongside knowledge of cosmetics and ornamentation. Semyaza revealed enchantments and the secrets of root cutting. Amaros taught the dissolving of magical seals. Barakel opened up the mysteries of astrology. Kokabel revealed the patterns of the constellations. Ezekiel taught the reading of clouds. Arakiel showed how to interpret signs written in the earth. Shamsiel illuminated the meanings embedded in the light of the sun, and Siriel described the courses of the moon. It is a remarkable list, and the longer one lingers with it, the stranger it becomes. These are not random fragments of magic. They form a curriculum, a map of power. Metallurgy, celestial interpretation, weather reading, medicinal or ritual botany, systems of sign and symbol. These are not childish marvels, but foundational technologies of civilization. And yet the Enochian tradition casts a shadow over these teachings that the Enki and Thoth traditions do not. Where Enki's gift of knowledge preserves and elevates, the Watcher's instruction is presented as fundamentally destabilizing, something that humanity was not yet ready to receive and could not yet responsibly bear. Their punishment, endless confinement until the final judgment of all things, serves as an ancient warning about the consequences of transgression, of giving fire to those who have not yet learned how to hold it safely. In that warning, there is an old and unmistakable human anxiety that power, once released, cannot easily be gathered back. That knowledge changes the one who receives it. That some thresholds once crossed do not close again behind us. And yet, when we place these three traditions side by side, Enki, Thoth, and the Watchers, the similarities are quietly remarkable. Across cultures, across languages, across centuries, a common structure begins to emerge. All three are bound to the invention and preservation of written language. Each tradition places the emergence of writing not as a human discovery, but as a divine gift, something transmitted from a higher order of being into human hands. The Sumerians attributed cuneiform to Enki's wisdom. Egyptians credited Thoth with the invention of hieroglyphs, that extraordinary system of living symbols capable of holding magical power within their carefully executed forms. The Watchers taught the arts of inscription and calculation as part of their broader curriculum of forbidden knowledge. Across three distinct cultures and multiple centuries of development, the written word appears not as a slow human invention, but as a gift lowered from above. That idea alone is enough to invite long reflection. Writing to us can seem ordinary because we are surrounded by it. But in the ancient world, it must have seemed astonishing. A visible mark that could preserve invisible thought. A silent surface that could speak across distance and time. A sequence of signs capable of outlasting the body, the voice, even the city that produced it. No wonder it was regarded as sacred. No wonder it was linked to gods. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge appears with equal consistency across all three bodies of tradition. Enki governed the measurement of land, the calculation of water flows, the engineering principles that made irrigation possible. Thoth presided over the development of the calendar, the mathematical structures underlying astronomical prediction, the precise computational methods that enabled Egyptian priests to know the movements of the sky months and years in advance. The Watchers, in their turn, transmitted the arts of astrology and celestial observation, teaching humanity to read the future in the patterns of the heavens. Ancient peoples, it seems, simply could not imagine that such knowledge arose from human minds alone. Its complexity, its precision, its sheer practical power placed it beyond the ordinary reach of mortal invention. It must have come from elsewhere. And perhaps, even now, we can understand why they felt that way. Because certain forms of knowledge do feel as though they are discovered rather than made. The stars move according to patterns not of our invention. Mathematical relationships exist whether or not anyone writes them down. The river obeys its own laws. The moon keeps its phases without asking permission of the human mind. To learn such things is not to create them, but to encounter them. The tension between knowledge and limitation, between what human beings might know and what they ought to know, runs through all three traditions like a quiet current. Enki's generosity sometimes brings him into conflict with the other gods, who would prefer to keep humanity in a more manageable state of ignorance. Thoth's function as recorder and regulator suggests that knowledge must be carefully distributed to preserve the delicate balance of cosmic order. And the Watcher's story makes that tension most explicit of all. Some knowledge, it insists, is simply too dangerous for human possession, and those who provide it without sanction will face consequences no mortal can fully imagine. This tension is one of the oldest in human thought, and perhaps one of the most enduring. Not whether knowledge exists, but how it should be handled. Not whether truth can be found, but when, and by whom, and at what cost. Even the symbolism of water appears across all three traditions, linking divine wisdom to the element most essential for life. Enki dwells in the underground ocean, governing the freshwater sources upon which Mesopotamian civilization depends. Thoth's lunar associations bind him to the tidal rhythms of the Great River, to the Nile's annual flood, and the agricultural cycles it makes possible. The Watchers descend during the Age of Jared, whose very name carries resonances of water and descent in the Hebrew tradition. Water flows where it will, life-giving and dangerous in equal measure, and ancient peoples seem to feel that knowledge was like water, indispensable, sustaining, and capable of destroying everything if it arrives without warning. It is a beautiful and unsettling comparison. Water nourishes, but it also erodes. It gives life, but it can also overwhelm. A river can sustain a city for centuries, and in a single season wash its boundaries away. So too with knowledge. It can make civilization possible. It can transform hunger into agriculture, darkness into calendar, fear into medicine. But when it comes too quickly, without structure, without wisdom, it can leave confusion in its wake. The geographical closeness of Mesopotamia and Egypt, connected by trade routes running through the Levant and along the coastlines of the ancient Mediterranean, created real opportunities for the exchange of religious and intellectual ideas. The Amarna letters and other diplomatic archives document ongoing conversations between the scholarly classes of these civilizations, suggesting that the parallels between Enki and Thoth may reflect not merely independent parallel development, but actual cross-cultural transmission of ideas about divine wisdom and its proper handling. Imagine caravans moving slowly between worlds. Copper and lapis lazuli, grain and linen, papyrus and carved ivory passing from one hand to another. But along with those visible goods moved quieter things, myths, formulas, names of stars, methods of calculation, ritual phrases, stories about who first taught humanity how to write or measure or heal. Ideas travel lightly. They slip between borders more easily than armies do. They rest in memory, in conversation, in the habits of priests and scribes who meet under foreign roofs and recognize in each other a familiar devotion to order and preservation. And yet the appearance of similar themes within the Enochian literature, composed in a different cultural context, drawing upon different source traditions, suggests that these patterns may also reflect something older and deeper, a universal human intuition about the nature of knowledge, its origins, and the risks it carries. Perhaps this is why such stories persist even when their original temples fall silent, because they speak not only to the history of particular civilizations, but to a pattern within human consciousness itself. We sense somehow that knowledge is unlike other possessions. It does not sit still. It transforms both the world and the one who holds it. It can be hidden, revealed, withheld, misused, sanctified. It can make us more human, and it can magnify the consequences of our failures. The practical dimensions of these traditions appear clearly in the archaeological record. The library assembled by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh held more than 30,000 cuneiform tablets, organized with systematic care and covering subjects ranging from astronomy and medicine to law and mythology. The organizing principles behind this extraordinary collection echoed Enki's role as the divine keeper of wisdom. Similarly, the Egyptian institution known as the House of Life, attached to temple complexes throughout the Nile Valley, functioned as a center for the copying, preservation, and development of sacred texts, directly reflecting Thoth's function as the divine scribe whose work maintained cosmic order. There is a kind of tenderness in these institutions, though they may not appear tender at first glance. A library is, after all, an act of trust. It assumes the future matters. It assumes that what is known now should not vanish with the people who know it. It assumes that someone not yet born may one day need these records, these calculations, these stories, these carefully pressed signs on clay or inked marks on papyrus. The mathematical and astronomical achievements preserved within these institutions continue to invite admiration. Sumerian mathematicians developed positional notation and sophisticated geometric principles that would not be independently rediscovered in Europe until the medieval period. Egyptian architects and engineers embedded within their greatest structures mathematical relationships that still strike modern scholars with their precision and elegance. The complexity of these achievements, appearing in the archaeological record with a suddenness that linear models of development struggle to fully explain, lent credibility in the ancient world, and perhaps still today, to the claim that such knowledge required instruction from beyond ordinary human experience. And here, in the quiet of night, one can understand why those ancient people looked upward when they considered such things. Why they placed wisdom in the hands of gods, or sages from the deep, or luminous beings descending through the sky. Not because they lacked intelligence, but because they recognized wonder. Because some achievements seemed to carry within them a degree of order so refined that they felt like participation in something greater than human improvisation. As we move through this landscape of divine wisdom and its keepers, let us pause for a moment within the deep symbolic resonance of names and languages, for the very words through which ancient peoples knew these figures carry layered meanings that reveal much about how they were understood. Names in the ancient world were rarely empty labels. They were vessels. They held function, character, relationship, sometimes even destiny. To know a name was not only to identify a being, but to glimpse something of its essence. The name of Thoth derives from ancient Egyptian, conventionally transliterated as Jehuti in modern Egyptology. The root connects to concepts of balance and precise measurement, while the grammatical form suggests an agent, one who measures, one who holds the scales level. The name carries within it the mathematical function that defines Thoth's role in the cosmic drama. Alternative readings connect his name to the ibis itself, the wading bird whose arrival in Egypt announced the beginning of the annual flood, whose curved beak mirrored the crescent moon, and whose appearance in the skies served as a reliable celestial calendar by which farmers could plan their planting, and priests could schedule their festivals. It is striking how often ancient wisdom chooses the language of precision, not force, not conquest, not speed. Measurement, balance, timing, counting, recording. These are quiet acts, patient acts. They require attention more than power. And perhaps that is why they were associated with wisdom deities rather than warrior gods. Linguistic comparison across ancient Near Eastern languages reveals striking parallels between the root of Thoth's name and the Akkadian term for intelligence or understanding. Consonantal structures that share an emphasis on cognitive function rather than raw power, on wisdom rather than dominance. This linguistic pattern appears across multiple wisdom deity names throughout the ancient Near East, suggesting a common conceptual framework, a shared understanding of what divine intelligence is, what it does, and how it differs from the kind of force that simply commands or destroys. Enki's name opens onto similarly layered meanings. The Sumerian components suggest a lord of the earth or a lord of the place, but the surface translation conceals deeper resonances. The element meaning lord carries connotations of priestly authority over natural forces, while the element meaning earth or place connects not to inert material, but to the foundational principle of material existence, the ground from which things grow, from which water rises, from which civilization emerges when wisdom is applied with care. His Akkadian name, Ea, derives from a term meaning house of water, emphasizing his intimate relationship with the life-giving freshwater springs that made agriculture possible in the flat, sun-baked plains between the rivers. Both names, in their deepest layers, point toward a principle of creative intelligence that operates through precision and measurement, not through force or authority alone. Both figures govern their respective domains not by commanding nature into submission, but by understanding its mathematical structure and working in harmony with its rhythms. This quiet alignment between their most fundamental designations suggests, across the barrier of thousands of miles and very different cultural contexts, a shared ancient intuition about the nature of true wisdom. There is something deeply restful in that idea, that wisdom is not domination, that it is not noise, that it does not shout. It listens, observes, measures, waits, and then acts in accordance with pattern. The functional connections between Enki and Thoth extend into the rich symbolic language of their visual representations, particularly in their shared association with the serpent, an image whose meanings run through ancient culture with extraordinary complexity and staying power. Enki appears in Mesopotamian cylinder seals and temple reliefs surrounded by streams of water from which serpentine creatures emerge, swimming in the divine waters that flow from his presence. One of his most ancient epithets describes him as the Great Serpent, a title that connects him not to the chaos serpents of other traditions, but to the transformative power that converts raw natural energy into the tools and structures of civilization. A famous cylinder seal, dating to around 2,500 years before the Common Era, depicts a scene many scholars interpret as Enki in his serpentine form, seated beside a tree, offering the gift of understanding to the first human beings. the tension between divine authority and divine generosity rendered in miniature, pressed into the surface of a smooth stone cylinder small enough to hold in one hand. There is something extraordinary about such small objects surviving so long. A seal, once rolled across clay by a living hand, now carried across thousands of years into ours. A gesture of offering still visible. A tree still standing in miniature. A divine figure still extending wisdom in silence. Thoth's serpent associations find expression through his connection to the uraeus, the protective cobra that adorned royal crowns and appeared throughout Egyptian sacred art as an emblem of divine authority. But his relationship to serpent symbolism goes deeper than royal iconography. Egyptian magical texts place Thoth in command of serpentine forces, able to neutralize venom through spoken words and written formulas. The deeper meaning within this tradition concerns his authority over dangerous knowledge itself, his role as the divine regulator who determines which practitioners may safely access the most powerful and potentially harmful forms of wisdom, and under what conditions that access may be granted. Again and again, the pattern returns. Knowledge as living power, potent and transformative, requiring more than curiosity, requiring preparation, requiring balance. The flow of water as a visual metaphor for divine knowledge transmission appears with remarkable consistency across the artistic traditions of both civilizations. Enki is depicted in Mesopotamian art with streams pouring from his body or from vessels he holds, those streams transforming as they flow into fields, canals, and the agricultural systems that sustain human life. A relief from the palace at Murray shows him pouring water before a king receiving divine authority. The flowing streams becoming rivers of wisdom that irrigate not merely physical fields, but the structures of legitimate governance. Egyptian artists rendered Thoth's aquatic associations through lunar and nilometric imagery, reliefs showing him recording the levels of the great river, astronomical ceilings depicting his control over the lunar phases that govern the Nile's annual cycle of retreat and inundation. To the ancient imagination, knowledge was not static. It moved, it nourished, it required channels. And perhaps that is why the image of water appears so naturally, so repeatedly. A thought can flood the mind, an insight can rise. A truth can seep slowly downward until it reaches hidden places. Memory itself can feel like a river, sometimes clear, sometimes silted, always moving towards some wider sea. Scribal implements, the reed pen, the ink palette, the clay tablet, the papyrus scroll, appear as shared iconographic elements that ground both figures in the practical work of knowledge preservation. In Sumerian art, Enki holds the tools of the scribe, while instructing human students in the arts of writing and mathematical calculation. The Weld Blundell prism, which preserves one of the most complete versions of the Sumerian king list, depicts Enki as the divine instructor who taught the first kings not only how to govern justly, but how to maintain accurate records of their governance. Thoth's scribal imagery is so pervasive throughout Egyptian religious art that it becomes the most immediate visual identifier of his presence. The reed pen, the palette, the scroll always in his hands, always recording, always ensuring that the precise truth of things is set down in a form that will last. And there, perhaps, is one of the most moving aspects of these ancient traditions. That wisdom is never only revelation, it is also preservation. Someone must write, someone must copy, someone must keep count, store the tablets, sharpen the reed, repair the archive, remember which shelf holds which text, which formula belongs to which star, which law applies to which case. Without those quiet hands, even divine wisdom vanishes. The institutional frameworks that developed to preserve and transmit this divine wisdom were as sophisticated as the knowledge they contained. And as we move more deeply into them, the pace of the world seems to slow again, as though we are entering spaces where time itself is treated with care, measured, recorded, and gently extended beyond the limits of a single human life. In Egypt, the House of Life, the Perank in the hieroglyphic texts, functioned not merely as a school or a library, but as a living center of knowledge. It was a place where texts were not only copied, but studied, interpreted, expanded, and sometimes quietly transformed as new generations of scribes encountered ancient wisdom and carried it forward in their own careful way. If you imagine walking through such a place, you might notice the coolness of the stone beneath your feet, the filtered light entering through narrow openings, the quiet presence of individuals bent over papyrus scrolls, their movements slow and deliberate. There is no haste here. Each symbol is formed with intention. Each line is placed with awareness that it may be read again, long after the writer is gone. Papyrus fragments from these archives reveal curricula arranged in deliberate hierarchical stages. This structure was not accidental. It reflected a deep understanding that knowledge unfolds gradually, that understanding must be built layer by layer, like the careful construction of a temple or the slow shaping of a riverbank. Beginning students learned literacy, basic arithmetic, and the religious formulas required for routine scribal duties. These were the foundations, the first tools, simple in appearance but essential in function. The ability to read, to write, to count. These are quiet powers, easily overlooked, yet without them, nothing more complex can take root. Advanced students worked with astronomical texts, medical procedures, and mathematical problems that required deeper comprehension of patterns and relationships. And here, the world begins to widen. The movement of the stars becomes meaningful. The structure of the body reveals its hidden logic. Numbers begin to speak not just of quantity, but of proportion, of harmony, of balance. The most senior practitioners gained access to sacred texts and oral traditions that were never committed to writing at all. These teachings were considered too powerful, too subtle, or too easily misunderstood to be preserved in fixed form. They were passed directly from teacher to student, voice to voice, mind to mind, in a process that required not only intellectual readiness, but a certain quality of presence, of attention, of inner steadiness. There is something deeply human in this decision. Even in a culture devoted to writing, some knowledge remained unwritten, not because it was less important, but because it was more so, because it required relationship, context, timing, because it could not be reduced to marks on a surface without losing something essential. Medical training within Egyptian temple schools demonstrates this principle with particular clarity. Those at the beginning of their studies learned anatomical fundamentals and herbal preparations that could be safely applied without full theoretical understanding. These were practical skills. How to treat wounds, how to ease pain, how to support the body as it heals. Advanced students learned surgical techniques and diagnostic methods requiring more sophisticated conceptual foundations. They began to understand not only what to do, but why it worked. How different parts of the body relate, how illness moves, how balance can be restored. Master physicians worked with procedures that involved invoking divine assistance, techniques that were considered genuinely dangerous in the hands of practitioners who had not yet undergone the necessary preparation. This was not superstition in the simplistic sense. It reflected an awareness that knowledge can affect not only the body, but the mind, the emotions, even the unseen dimensions of experience. The system was designed not merely to transmit knowledge, but to ensure that the people who received it were ready, not only intellectually, but ethically and emotionally, to use it wisely. Mesopotamian tablet house schools, the Edubai, meaning literally house of tablets, operated according to parallel principles adapted to the different cultural and linguistic landscape of Sumerian and Akkadian civilization. Archaeological excavations at Nippur, Babylon, and Sippar have brought to light extensive archives of student exercises, teaching texts, and advanced scholarly works that reveal carefully designed educational progressions. The clay tablets themselves, preserved by time and accident, still carry the impressions of student hands. Repeated signs, corrected lines, careful attempts at accuracy. Students began with simple sign recognition and basic mathematical tables. They learned to shape the wedge, to press it at the correct angle, to space the marks evenly. These early exercises required patience. There was no room for haste. A hurried hand produced unclear signs, and unclear signs could not carry meaning reliably forward. As they advanced, students moved into literary composition, astronomical calculation, and the interpretation of legal precedents. Each stage required a deeper level of understanding, not only of the symbols themselves, but of the systems they represented. Language became more than communication. It became structure. It became a way of organizing reality. The highest levels of instruction involved oral traditions passed between teacher and student without written record, ensuring that the most potent knowledge remained insulated from casual access. And again, we encounter the same principle, that some forms of understanding require more than exposure. They require readiness. The connection between these schools and the temple complexes that housed them reveals how education and religious authority were understood as expressions of a single integrated reality. To learn was not separate from the sacred. To understand was to participate, in some small way, in the order of the cosmos itself. Students who completed advanced training became temple administrators, royal advisors, or independent scholars who served as intermediaries between the knowledge traditions preserved in sacred institutions and the practical needs of the wider world. They were bridges, not unlike the divine figures they studied, carrying knowledge from its source into application. This system created scholarly networks that maintained the living transmission of divine wisdom across political disruptions and cultural transformations, flexible enough to survive change, disciplined enough to preserve essential continuity. Beyond these institutional frameworks, the physical geography of sacred sites provided the material infrastructure through which divine knowledge was organized and maintained. And here, the land itself becomes part of the story. Eridu, which Mesopotamian tradition remembers as the very first city, shows continuous occupation spanning more than 4,000 years. Its temple complexes were built, rebuilt, and expanded according to consistent architectural principles that encoded understandings of cosmic order in their proportions and alignments. The site's position at the convergence of ancient waterways made it simultaneously a practical center for hydraulic engineering and a symbolic representation of Enki's domain at the intersection of terrestrial and divine waters. If you imagine standing there long ago, you might feel the quiet presence of both realities at once. The visible flow of water through canals and channels, and the invisible idea of knowledge flowing through minds and generations. The main temple axis aligns with the star canopus, a crucial navigation marker in ancient Mesopotamian celestial maps. Priestly records from the site describe how these astronomical alignments enabled the calculation of festival dates, the prediction of seasonal changes, and the maintenance of calendrical systems that coordinated agricultural and commercial activities across the entire river valley. This is where the abstract becomes practical. The stars are not only beautiful, they are useful. They guide planting, harvesting, movement, timing. Knowledge becomes survival, and survival becomes continuity. In Egypt, Heliopolis, the city of the sun, served as the primary center for solar theology and the astronomical observation upon which Egyptian religious and agricultural calendars depended. The great Bemben stone housed in its central temple functioned not only as a religious focal point, but as a precision instrument for marking solar positions throughout the year. Priests at Heliopolis used these observations to maintain the civil calendar, coordinate religious festivals, and predict the Nile's annual flood with the kind of accuracy that made the difference between abundance and catastrophe for millions of people living in the river's long shadow. Again, the pattern returns. Observation, recording, application. The movement of the sun becomes a tool. The cycle of the river becomes a measure. Knowledge becomes a quiet form of stability in a world that might otherwise feel uncertain. Hermopolis, Thoth's sacred city, whose Egyptian name Khemenu referred to the 8 primordial deities who existed before the world's creation, became the intellectual capital of ancient Egypt. Scholars traveled from throughout the Nile Valley to study there. Its astronomical observatory incorporated instruments for tracking lunar phases, planetary movements, and stellar positions with a precision that enabled Egyptian astronomers to develop predictive models of extraordinary accuracy. The Hermopolitan creation narrative, which describes Thoth as the divine voice whose spoken word brought the universe into existence, provided the theological foundation upon which Egyptian understanding of the relationship between human knowledge and cosmic order was built. It is a beautiful idea that understanding the world is, in some sense, listening to it. That knowledge is not imposed, but received. That the universe speaks quietly, in patterns and cycles, and that the role of the wise is to hear and record. The role of written law within these knowledge systems reveals another dimension of how ancient civilizations used literacy as a technology of power and order. The law code of Ur-Nammu, dating to around 2,100 years before the Common Era, represents one of the earliest attempts to create systematic legal frameworks built upon written precedents rather than oral tradition. Its prologue describes the ruler receiving divine instruction in legal principles from Enki and other wisdom deities, a claim that served both spiritual and political purposes, establishing the written law as an expression of divine will rather than merely human authority. There is something stabilizing in written law. It removes some of the unpredictability of human decision. It creates continuity. It allows a society to function not only through memory, but through structure. The mathematical precision embedded in legal calculations, the complex proportional systems for determining damages, penalties, and restitution, created a demand for specialized scholarly expertise that could only be satisfied through institutional education. And so, knowledge continued to expand, to organize itself, to build frameworks within frameworks. Hammurabi of Babylon represents perhaps the most elaborately documented example of this tradition. The famous black diorite stele, on which his law code is inscribed, begins with a careful account of how Marduk, the supreme god of Babylon, selected Hammurabi as the instrument through which divine justice would be brought into human affairs. The relief carved at the top of the stele shows the king standing before the seated figure of Shamash, the sun deity associated with divine law, who extends the rod and ring of cosmic authority toward the mortal ruler. But administrative texts from Hammurabi's reign reveal that the king regularly consulted with Enki's priests when formulating legal precedents, particularly in matters involving water rights, agricultural disputes, and craft guild regulations. Precisely the domains that ancient tradition placed under Enki's divine supervision. Even here, in the realm of law and governance, the presence of wisdom remains essential. Rules must be measured. Decisions must be balanced. Authority must be guided by understanding, not merely enforced by power. Egyptian pharaonic authority developed parallel structures for grounding royal legitimacy in connection to Thoth's knowledge-keeping functions. Coronation rituals emphasized the pharaoh's intellectual relationship to divine wisdom, alongside the military and dynastic aspects of royal authority. Administrative papyri from the Middle Kingdom show how the vast bureaucratic machinery of Egyptian government operated according to mathematical and organizational principles that officials understood as practical applications of divine instruction. Tax assessment, land measurement, and resource allocation all followed systematic procedures requiring the kind of advanced mathematical understanding that scribal schools attributed to Thoth's original teachings. The Rind mathematical papyrus, created specifically for scribal training, presents problems involving pyramid construction, grain storage, and astronomical calculation as practical applications of divine mathematical principles, techniques revealed by Thoth to the earliest Egyptian sages and preserved through careful institutional transmission down through the centuries. And so, across land and language, across river and desert, the same quiet truth continues to unfold. Knowledge, when carefully held, becomes structure. Structure, when wisely applied, becomes stability. And stability allows life to continue, to grow, to rest. Mystery schools and initiation traditions developed as the most carefully guarded institutions within ancient knowledge-keeping systems, designed to ensure that the most powerful forms of wisdom reached only those who had demonstrated the capacity and the character to handle it responsibly. And as we move into this quieter, more hidden layer of the ancient world, everything becomes softer, more interior, more difficult to grasp directly. These were not places of open instruction. They were places of transition, where knowledge was not only learned, but experienced. The Egyptian house of life offered the most visible expression of this structure. But behind it, as behind many things in the ancient world, there were deeper levels, each one more selective, more demanding, more inward. Initiation was not simply a ceremony, it was a process, a gradual reshaping of perception, of attention, of identity itself. The pyramid texts describe experiences that involved symbolic death and rebirth, not in a literal sense, but in a psychological and spiritual one. Candidates were led through carefully structured sequences designed to dissolve familiar patterns of thought and replace them with something more stable, more aligned with what was understood as cosmic order. There is something profoundly quiet about this idea, that to receive deeper knowledge, one must first become still enough to hold it. That understanding is not only an addition, but sometimes a transformation, a letting go of what is no longer sufficient. From the perspective of those who participated in these traditions, these experiences were not metaphors. They were real encounters, moments in which the boundary between human awareness and divine intelligence became, however briefly, more permeable. Knowledge in this context was not simply information, it was contact. As we follow this thread forward, we begin to see how fragile such systems were, and how much they depended on continuity. Because knowledge of this kind does not survive easily in isolation. It requires teachers. It requires institutions. It requires a culture that values patience, precision, and long-term preservation. And so, when disruption comes, it does not merely interrupt, it erases. As we move through the long arc of time from those ancient beginnings, we encounter a period of catastrophic change that threatened to break the chain of transmission entirely. The Late Bronze Age collapse, occurring approximately between 1200 and 1150 years before the Common Era, did not simply bring down kingdoms. It fractured the networks that allowed knowledge to move, to be shared, to be preserved. The evidence, scattered across archaeological sites throughout the eastern Mediterranean, tells a quiet but unmistakable story. The palace complex at Pylos, once filled with orderly records and carefully stored tablets, was destroyed by fire. The clay tablets, hardened by the heat, survived, but the system that produced them did not. The scribes were gone. The training was interrupted. The continuity was broken. Similar patterns appear at Knossos, Mycenae, and other centers across the Aegean and the Levant. Places that once held living traditions of knowledge became silent. Ugarit, a city that had served as a bridge between cultures, preserving texts in multiple languages and writing systems, was abandoned entirely. Its archives, once vibrant with exchange and interpretation, were left behind, fragments of a conversation that could no longer continue. The Hittite Empire, which had integrated Mesopotamian wisdom traditions into its own cultural framework, collapsed during the same period. Its capital, Hattusa, contained carefully maintained archives, records of law, ritual, astronomy, and administration. When those archives were destroyed, something more than documents was lost. A way of understanding the world, a synthesis built over generations, disappeared. Egypt endured this period with greater resilience than many of its neighbors. But even there, the effects were felt. Resources shifted toward defense. Temple schools reduced their scope. Smaller centers of learning were abandoned. The slow, patient work of knowledge preservation gave way, at least in part, to the immediate demands of survival. And so, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the great networks of shared understanding began to fragment. What had once been a connected system became a series of isolated strands. Astronomical knowledge continued in some regions, but separated from its broader philosophical context. Mathematical techniques persisted, but often reduced to practical application, rather than deeper inquiry. Ritual tradition survived, but sometimes without the explanatory frameworks that had once given them coherence. It is a quiet kind of loss. Not a single event, but a gradual fading. And yet, even here, something remarkable occurs. Knowledge does not disappear entirely. It changes form. It adapts. It hides. The religious transformations of the subsequent Iron Age introduced new frameworks that reshaped the way knowledge was understood and transmitted. The rise of monotheistic traditions required a reorganization of earlier systems. Figures like Enki and Thoth could no longer remain as independent divine sources of wisdom within a worldview centered on a single supreme authority. Their roles shifted. Their functions were absorbed, transformed, or reinterpreted within new theological structures. In some cases, older knowledge traditions were suppressed. In others, they were preserved in altered form, encoded within stories, symbols, or practices that could continue without directly contradicting emerging beliefs. The Deuteronomic reforms, for example, centralized worship and reduced the influence of local knowledge centers. This had the effect of narrowing the channels through which older traditions could be maintained. And yet, even as formal structures changed, the underlying patterns remained. Because knowledge, like water, finds its way. It moves through unexpected paths. It settles in quiet places. It reappears in new forms. The Hellenistic period brought a new kind of convergence, one that allowed fragments of ancient wisdom to be gathered, studied, and reinterpreted within a different intellectual framework. Cities like Alexandria became centers where Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Greek traditions could meet. Scholars trained in different systems encountered one another, compared methods, translated texts, and attempted to reconcile different ways of understanding the same underlying patterns. This was not a simple process. It required patience, openness, and a willingness to see beyond the boundaries of one's own tradition. But it also created something new. A synthesis that preserved elements of the past while making them accessible in a changing world. Manetho, an Egyptian priest writing in Greek, compiled systematic accounts of Egyptian history and religious tradition, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Berossus, a Babylonian priest, did the same for Mesopotamian culture, recording traditions that stretched back into the earliest periods of civilization. These efforts were acts of quiet preservation. Not dramatic, not forceful, but essential. They ensured that even as the original institutions faded, their knowledge would not vanish entirely. The Apkallu, the 7 antediluvian sages of Mesopotamian tradition, offer a particularly clear example of how ancient cultures understood the transmission of wisdom. These figures, described as emerging from the waters of the Abzu, served as intermediaries between divine knowledge and human society. Each was associated with specific domains: governance, agriculture, construction, mathematics, and more. Together, they formed a complete system, a curriculum for civilization itself. Their presence in the tradition reflects a consistent idea: that knowledge is not random, but structured. That it can be organized, transmitted, and applied in ways that support human life. Berossus describes the first of these sages, Oans, as emerging from the sea each day to teach humanity the arts of civilization, returning each night to the depths. There is something deeply rhythmic in that image. Knowledge appears, is given, and then withdraws, not permanently, but in cycles. It does not overwhelm, it arrives in measure. This pattern echoes the earlier traditions of Enki and Thoth, where knowledge flows gradually, in alignment with readiness and need. And so, even as civilizations rise and fall, even as institutions are built and destroyed, the deeper pattern remains. Knowledge continues to move. It is preserved where it can be preserved. It is adapted where it must be adapted. It is hidden when it cannot be openly maintained. And always, it waits quietly for those who are willing to receive it with care. The Library of Alexandria represented perhaps the most ambitious institutional attempt ever undertaken to gather, preserve, and synthesize the accumulated wisdom of human civilization. And as we enter this space, the atmosphere shifts once more, not into secrecy, as with the mystery schools, but into vastness. Imagine long halls filled with scrolls, the soft rustle of papyrus, the faint scent of ink and cedar oil used to preserve the fragile materials. Light filtering in through high windows, illuminating rows upon rows of knowledge carefully gathered from distant lands. Scholars moving quietly, each carrying fragments of understanding from different traditions, different languages, different ways of seeing the world. It was a place built not only on preservation, but on connection. Ptolemaic rulers invested enormous resources in acquiring texts from throughout the known world, from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Persia, and beyond. Ships arriving in the harbor were searched not only for goods, but for manuscripts. Copies were made, originals sometimes retained. The goal was not ownership, but completeness, to gather as much of human knowledge as possible into a single, living archive. The scholars who worked within Alexandria developed methods that would shape intellectual life for centuries to come. They compared different versions of the same text, identifying variations, correcting errors, reconstructing original meanings from fragmented sources. This was careful work, quiet work, the kind of work that does not call attention to itself, but without which understanding slowly degrades. They built upon ancient foundations while developing new theoretical frameworks. Euclid's systematic exposition of geometric principles preserved essential mathematical insights derived from Mesopotamian and Egyptian sources, presenting them in a form that could be studied and applied with clarity and precision. Eratosthenes, drawing upon both Greek reasoning and Egyptian observational traditions, calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. A quiet demonstration of how ancient knowledge, when preserved and extended, could reach far beyond its original form. These achievements were not isolated moments of brilliance. They were continuations, the unfolding of patterns that had begun long before, along rivers and under stars, carried forward through careful transmission. And yet, even this great center of knowledge was not immune to change. The gradual decline and eventual loss of the Library of Alexandria did not occur in a single moment. It was a process, slow, complex, shaped by political shifts, economic pressures, and changing cultural priorities. Scrolls were lost, scholars dispersed, the continuity of preservation weakened, and once again we encounter the same fragile truth. Knowledge depends on care. Without it, even the greatest collections fade. Similar losses occurred elsewhere. The Great Library at Nalanda in India, a center of learning that had preserved knowledge for centuries, was destroyed, its texts consumed by fire. Mayan codices, containing sophisticated astronomical and mathematical systems developed independently of Mediterranean traditions, were largely lost during the Spanish conquest. Each of these events represents not only destruction, but silence, entire conversations interrupted, entire ways of understanding the world reduced to fragments. And yet, even here, the pattern continues. Because knowledge does not vanish completely. It leaves traces. It echoes. It survives in altered forms. One of the most fascinating examples of this survival is the figure of Hermes Trismegistus, a synthesis that emerged from the meeting of Greek and Egyptian traditions during the Hellenistic period. Hermes, the Greek messenger god, and Thoth, the Egyptian scribe, were recognized as reflections of the same underlying principle. Over time, their identities merged, forming a new figure, one who carried forward aspects of both traditions. The Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of texts associated with this figure, presents a philosophical vision in which the structure of the cosmos is mirrored in the structure of the human mind. This idea, simple in its expression but profound in its implications, suggests that understanding the world and understanding oneself are not separate processes, but interconnected ones. As above, so below. This principle, often repeated but rarely fully considered, carries within it an entire worldview. It implies that patterns repeat across scales, that the same structures appear in different forms, that knowledge gained in one domain can illuminate another. Ancient traditions had long observed such correspondences. The cycles of the moon reflected in biological rhythms. The movement of planets mirrored in patterns of time and behavior. Geometric proportions appearing in architecture, in art, in the structure of living forms. These were not seen as coincidences, but as expressions of an underlying order, an order that could be studied, understood, and perhaps even aligned with. Medieval Islamic scholarship played a crucial role in preserving and extending these traditions during a time when much of Europe had lost direct access to classical sources. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad became a center for translation and synthesis, where texts from Greek, Persian, and earlier traditions were studied, preserved, and expanded upon. Scholars worked carefully, translating not only words, but ideas, adapting them into new contexts while maintaining their essential structure. Figures like Jabir ibn Hayyan developed systematic approaches to experimentation, combining practical knowledge of materials with theoretical frameworks derived from earlier traditions. His work in alchemy, often misunderstood in later periods, was not merely about transformation of substances, but about understanding processes, how things change, how elements interact, how hidden structures can be revealed through careful observation. Again, we see the same pattern. Knowledge as process, not possession. The rediscovery of ancient texts in later periods brought new insights into the sophistication of early civilizations. The decipherment of cuneiform in the 19th century opened access to vast archives of Mesopotamian writing, revealing systems of mathematics, astronomy, and law far more advanced than previously understood. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the 20th century, provided new context for ancient Jewish traditions, including texts related to the Watchers and the transmission of knowledge. These discoveries did not create new knowledge. They revealed what had been preserved, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes fragmentarily, but still present. And so, as we move gently towards the close of this long journey, a larger pattern begins to settle into view. Across all these traditions, across all these centuries, one idea returns again and again, quiet but persistent. Knowledge and wisdom are not the same thing. Knowledge can be gathered, stored, transmitted. It can be written, copied, measured, expanded. Wisdom, however, requires something more. It requires balance. It requires timing. It requires an understanding not only of what can be done, but of what should be done. Enki represents knowledge that flows, generous, life-giving, practical. Thoth represents knowledge that measures, precise, balanced, sustaining order. The Watchers represent knowledge that arrives too soon, powerful, real, but destabilizing when given without preparation. These are not separate ideas. They are aspects of the same underlying truth. And perhaps that is why these stories have endured. Not because they provide simple answers, but because they preserve the complexity of the question. What is knowledge for? How should it be used? When should it be shared, and when should it be held back? These questions have not faded with time. If anything, they have become more immediate. If anything, they have become more immediate. Because the world we inhabit now, though so different in its forms, carries the same quiet tensions that those ancient traditions were already trying to understand. Knowledge moves faster than ever. It spreads across distances that once took months or years in a matter of moments. It gathers in vast, unseen networks, flowing continuously, almost without pause. and yet the questions remain unchanged. What should be known? Who should know it? And when does knowing become something more than understanding? Something that carries weight, consequence, responsibility. The ancient traditions did not resolve these questions. They did something perhaps more valuable. They preserved them. They shaped them into stories, into symbols, into systems that could endure across time, so that each new generation might encounter them again, not as relics, but as living inquiries. Enki's quiet generosity, Thoth's careful balance, the Watcher's troubling descent. Each reflects a different relationship to knowledge, a different way of holding it, offering it, or misplacing it. And as we rest with these figures now, in the gentle stillness of the present moment, they begin to feel less like distant mythological beings, and more like patterns, ways of thinking, ways of being, that continue to move within human experience. There are moments when knowledge flows easily, when understanding comes naturally, when insight feels like something received rather than constructed. These are moments of Enki, when the waters rise quietly from beneath and bring clarity with them. There are moments when knowledge must be measured, when precision matters, when careful observation and restraint preserve balance. These are moments of Thoth, when the pen moves slowly, when the scales remain steady, when truth is recorded without distortion. And there are moments when knowledge arrives before its time, when power exceeds understanding, when something is revealed that cannot yet be held wisely. These are moments of the Watchers, when the boundary between knowing and wisdom becomes visible, and the consequences of crossing it begin to unfold. None of these patterns belong only to the past. They move through every age, including our own. And perhaps that is why the ancient peoples placed such care in preserving their stories. Not because they believed the past was complete, but because they understood that the questions it held would continue to return. If you imagine for a moment the long passage of time stretching quietly behind us, you might begin to feel how many hands have carried knowledge forward. Hands that shaped clay tablets under open skies. Hands that held reed pens in dimly lit chambers. Hands that turned fragile pages, that copied lines carefully, that paused to correct a mark so that meaning would remain intact. Each of those hands belonged to someone who lived, breathed, wondered, and eventually faded into silence. And yet what they preserved continues. There is a quiet continuity in that, a kind of invisible thread connecting minds across centuries. Not perfectly, not without loss, but persistently. And perhaps, as you rest now, listening, you are also part of that thread, not as a keeper of ancient tablets or a recorder of celestial movements, but as someone who receives, who reflects, who allows understanding to settle gently into awareness. The stars above us tonight are the same stars that Thoth's priests tracked from their observation platforms in Hermopolis. The same constellations that Enki's scribes recorded on clay tablets in Eridu. The same sky through which the Watchers were said to descend. And if you were to step outside now, into the quiet night, and allow your eyes to adjust slowly, you might notice how still they appear, how calm, how unhurried. They do not rush, they do not strain. They move according to patterns so vast that they require no urgency. And in that, there is something deeply soothing, because it reminds us that not everything needs to be understood at once. Not everything needs to be held tightly or solved immediately. Some things unfold slowly, over time, in ways that cannot be forced. Ancient observers knew this well. They did not attempt to command the sky. They watched it. night after night, season after season, recording small changes, building understanding patiently. They trusted that meaning would emerge, not through urgency, but through attention. And that same principle remains available now. Understanding can be slow. It can be gentle. It can arrive without effort, like a quiet realization that appears when the mind is still. The rivers of the ancient world carried more than water. They carried time itself. The Tigris and the Euphrates, winding through fertile land, sustained entire civilizations. But they also taught those civilizations something essential. That life depends on rhythm. That too much force destroys, and too little brings stagnation. That balance must be observed, adjusted, respected. The Nile, rising and falling with seasonal precision, offered a different but related lesson. That cycles can be trusted. That what disappears will return. That patience allows renewal. These were not abstract ideas. They were lived experiences. And perhaps, in a quieter way, they remain present even now. Your breath follows a rhythm. In and out. Rising and falling. It does not need to be controlled. It continues on its own, steady and reliable. And as you notice it, gently, without forcing it, you may begin to feel the same calm continuity that ancient observers felt when watching rivers or stars. There is something deeply reassuring in repetition, in patterns that hold, in movements that continue without interruption. Even knowledge itself follows this rhythm. It rises, is discovered, spreads, is forgotten, and then is found again. Sometimes in new forms, sometimes in fragments, sometimes in ways that feel familiar without being fully understood. And this too can be restful, because it means nothing is entirely lost. Even when knowledge disappears from one place, it often remains somewhere else, waiting quietly to be rediscovered. The ancient traditions remind us of this again and again. The loss of a library is not the end of knowledge. The fall of a city is not the end of understanding. The silence of one generation does not erase what another has preserved. It simply changes the path through which knowledge must travel. And sometimes that path becomes more subtle. It moves through stories instead of systems, through symbols instead of direct instruction, through quiet intuition rather than formal teaching. And so, as we rest here, at the end of this long journey, there is no need to gather everything, to hold it all, to remember every detail. The ancient scribes themselves did not expect that. They recorded carefully, yes, but they also understood that knowledge lives not only in words, but in the way the mind receives them, in the way attention softens, in the way understanding settles, in the way meaning remains, even when the exact form begins to fade. And so you can allow that now. Allow the details to soften. Allow the images to become distant. Allow the story to dissolve gently, like writing washed by water, leaving only the impression behind. There is no effort required, only rest. The temples grow quiet. The scribes set down their tools. The rivers continue their slow and patient movement. And the stars, high above, remain steady, silent witnesses to everything that has been and everything that will continue. If you listen closely, not with your ears, but with a quieter part of awareness, you might notice that nothing is truly urgent here. Time is moving, yes, but not in a way that demands anything from you. It carries gently. It holds without pressure. And within that movement, you are allowed to rest. You do not need to solve the ancient questions tonight. You do not need to understand the full depth of what has been passed down across centuries. It is enough that you have listened. It is enough that you have been here. The knowledge will continue, whether or not you hold it consciously. Just as the rivers continue to flow, even when unseen. Just as the stars continue to turn, even when the sky is covered by clouds. Everything that matters is already in motion. And you are part of that motion, gently held within it, supported by patterns that do not require your effort to continue. Let your breathing slow now. Feel the steady rise and fall, effortless and calm. Let the body become heavier, more supported, more at ease. Let the thoughts that remain drift further away, like distant echoes fading into silence. There is nothing more to follow, nothing more to hold. Only the quiet presence of this moment and the soft awareness that everything needed is already here. Far away, beyond the edges of waking thought, the Tigris and the Euphrates still wind their way through ancient land. The Nile still rises and falls with patient rhythm. And the stars that were once counted and recorded with such care continue their silent movement across the night sky. Everything is continuing. Everything is held. And so, gently, you can let go. Let the story fade. Let the mind rest. Let the body settle more deeply into stillness. Good night, dear listener. Sleep well.